In July 2023, the Australian state of Victoria cancelled the 2026 Commonwealth Games. The decision came just 15 months after it had agreed to host them. There was no war, no pandemic, and no shortage of athletes willing to compete. The government said the problem was money. What had first been presented as a $2.6 billion project was now expected to cost more than 6 billion Australian dollars. So, Victoria walked away. But cancelling the games did not erase the bill. By the time the damage was counted, Victoria had spent more than 589 million Australian dollars on an event that never happened. No opening ceremony, no medals, no international crowds. Then the story became almost unbelievable. Some of the money connected to Victoria's withdrawal would later help another city, more than 16,000 kilometers away, stage the same event. That city was Glasgow. Scotland would host a smaller version of the Games, using venues it already had, for a fraction of Victoria's projected cost. So how did Victoria spend more than $500 million cancelling games that Glasgow could still afford to host? Was the plan badly designed? Were the costs exaggerated? Or had the government made a political promise before it understood what that promise would require? This is the Power Map. The Commonwealth Games once promised host cities tourism, construction, global attention, and national prestige, but by the 2020s, fewer cities wanted the financial risk. The 2022 Games had originally been awarded to Durban in South Africa. When Durban failed to meet its financial commitments, Birmingham stepped in. Then, organizers needed a host for 2026. There was no major bidding war. In April 2022, Victoria accepted the event, but it did not propose a normal Commonwealth Games. Melbourne already had many of the venues and transport links needed to host an international competition. Instead, the government decided to spread the Games across Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo, Gippsland, and Shepparton. The plan sounded transformative. Investment would be spread beyond Melbourne. Sporting facilities would be upgraded. New housing would be built. Regional communities would be placed on the world stage. The Games were now more than a sporting event. They had become a statewide development project, and that made them far more complicated. A compact event can reuse the same venues, accommodation, transport, and security systems. Victoria's model required many of those systems to be repeated across several locations. More cities meant more transport, more temporary facilities, more accommodation, more security, and more opportunities for costs to rise. Victoria had taken an event already struggling to find hosts and designed one of its most difficult possible versions. The timing also mattered. The plan was announced in April 2022. A Victorian state election was due later that year. Regional communities were politically important. And the Games gave the government a powerful promise: jobs, housing, infrastructure, tourism, and billions of dollars directed outside Melbourne. There is no evidence that the government secretly planned to cancel the Games after the election. But there is strong evidence that the promise came before the numbers were reliable. When Victoria accepted the event, the public estimate was around 2.6 billion Australian dollars. Just over a year later, Premier Daniel Andrews announced that the cost could exceed 6 billion. A later estimate approached 6.9 billion. Andrews said Victoria could not take money away from hospitals, housing, and essential services to fund a 12-day sporting event. Once the choice was framed as hospitals or stadiums, cancellation looked responsible. But the Victorian Auditor General later found that the financial story was not that simple. The original business case had underestimated costs and overstated benefits. The number used to sell the Games was unreliable, but the much larger number used to cancel them was also questioned. The estimate of roughly $6.9 billion included about $1 billion in contingency funding. That was not made clear when the headline figure was presented to the public. Victoria had sold the Games using one unreliable number. Then it canceled them using another. By then, contracts had been signed, staff had been hired, and hundreds of millions of dollars were already at risk. Canceling the Games stopped future spending. It did not remove the obligations Victoria had already created. In August 2023, the state agreed to pay 380 million Australian dollars in compensation. More money had already been spent on consultants, staff, planning, and projects connected to the event. The total cost of bidding, planning, and withdrawing rose beyond $589 million. Victoria had paid more than $500 million, but there was no event, no promised regional legacy, and no clear public benefit. For a time, the 2026 Commonwealth Games appeared close to collapse. Then Glasgow stepped in. Glasgow had hosted the Games in 2014. It already had venues, infrastructure, and experienced organizers. More importantly, it did not try to recreate Victoria's plan. It cut the event down. The Scottish version would use 4 main venues and include only 10 sports. There would be no newly built athletes' village. Around 3,000 athletes would compete. Several sports would be removed entirely. Glasgow treated the Commonwealth Games as a sporting competition, not as a plan to transform an entire region. Its estimated budget was roughly £114 million, and part of that funding came from Australia. Commonwealth Games Australia committed $100 million Australian dollars towards the Glasgow event, with further contingency support available. Australia had not only paid to cancel its own games, Australian money was now helping Scotland host them. At first glance, this seems to prove that Victoria's figures were absurd. Nearly $7 billion in Victoria, a small fraction of that in Glasgow. But the two plans were not the same. Victoria wanted a large event spread across several regional centres and tied to housing, transport, and development promises. Glasgow offered a reduced competition concentrated in venues it already had. Scotland did not discover a cheap way to deliver Victoria's exact Commonwealth Games. It removed much of what had made Victoria's version so expensive, and that exposes the real failure. If Victoria's plan was unaffordable, why was it designed that way? Why spread the event across several cities when Melbourne already had major venues? Why attach so many political promises to a 12-day sporting competition? And why commit to the Games before producing a dependable business case? The most dramatic theory is that the entire project was an election stunt from the beginning. There is no evidence proving that. The more convincing explanation is simpler. Political ambition moved faster than proper planning. The benefits were announced first. The risks arrived later. Victoria escaped the full cost of hosting the Games, but it did so by spending more than $589 million not to host them. Glasgow then rescued the event by removing many of the ambitions Victoria had attached to it. That is the real lesson of this collapse. The Games themselves may not have been the most expensive part. The expensive part was everything the government wanted the Games to become. Victoria tried to use a sporting event to transform an entire region. Glasgow used existing venues to stage a sporting event. One plan collapsed before a single medal was awarded. The other survived using money from that collapse. And Victorians were left paying for the Commonwealth Games twice. Once for the event they were promised, and again for the event they never received.